You're on.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you guys too for your time and attention, and particularly at this early hour of the morning and the weather being what it is. I was hired by Jameson Health System to come in and do a review of your facility, particularly the way that you document the care that you provide to your residents. Obviously, being in long-term care, there's a significant burden for documentation in this setting that doesn't exist in most other healthcare settings. You're required to document your resident care in the way that you do for a number of different reasons. So I want to talk about what some of those reasons are today. I want to talk about the specific instructions for how you're being asked to document your resident care. And more importantly, I think, we all need to appreciate why it is that we have to document resident care and what it is that it counts for. I'm a nurse. I've been in long-term care for 25 years, so I've seen a lot of changes to the environment. Most of the changes that we've seen over the past 25 years have been in response to either state or federal regulations, as more and more residents have their health care benefits paid by either Medicaid or Medicare. The government has become increasingly involved in every aspect of what we provide to our residents and what we do here. So a lot of what you have to document is in response to a federal regulation of some sort. There was a law passed in 1987 called OBRA. It really provided the regulatory framework for everything that we do in long-term care, from your state and federal surveys to the way that residents receive their benefits. And a lot of what you do is really geared around satisfying those requirements. But if you look at your documentation and what it's intended to accomplish from a nursing perspective, primarily, you document what you document about resident care, because really what you're saying drives the care plan for every resident. When a resident's admitted here to your facility and we know very little about them and what they can and can't do and what they need and what they can do for themselves, the care plan team really relies on your documentation to establish expectations for the residents. When care plan goals are written, literally they're going to be based on whatever you said about that resident during the period of time when their care plan was being written. If you said that they could dress themselves with limited assistance, the goal on their care plan would be that they would continue to do that. If you said they needed extensive assistance for their meals, then that would become their goal. So really, you're the ones who identify what the residents' goals are when their care plan is written. And the reason that that's important is because that goal lets us know what a resident was doing at a particular time in space. Moving forward from that, then, every day, the idea is to compare your documentation of what that resident did on that given day to what they were doing when the care plan was written. That allows the entire team to see whether the resident's still doing the same things, whether they're performing at the same level or whether they're not doing as well. So that when a resident doesn't meet those care plan goals, we know that we have to investigate what potentially happened to that resident, that they're no longer doing the same things, and how do we now need to respond to them to make sure their needs continue to be met. That's really fundamentally the reason why you would do this documentation in any setting. Because you're in long-term care and because of our regulatory environment, though, the way that you report those codes is mandated by the federal government. There's a standardized resident assessment that began with the OBRA regulation back in 1987 that dictates how nursing homes have to report resident care, how they have to assess residents, and how they have to care plan. And it's a very structured and very rigid format for resident assessment, and it tells us exactly how to document everything that we do. So when you're doing your documentation, the codes that you have to select to describe your resident care aren't optional. All nursing homes in the country have to report the same exact way. So when we talk about self-performance and support codes, they're not something that's particular to Pennsylvania or to Jameson Health System. They're nationwide codes that are standard in the industry. As such, there are a very specific set of instructions for exactly how to use those codes, what the definitions are, which codes to select, and how to know which ones to use. And that's really what I want to focus a lot of our time on today, is how do you know which code to select based on what the resident's doing. Also, though, it's not just about reporting resident care, formulating care plans, watching for changes in resident conditions. like I said before, your codes actually determine what the resident's benefits for Medicaid or Medicare are going to be, or even now, to the point if they're Security Blue or UPMC, they're using the same systems. And what you document about your resident reports how much care you provided to them. That then in turn determines how much benefit they're allowed to have in this setting. It's the only place in healthcare that works like this. If you or I get sick, we go to the doctor, we go to the hospital. What our insurance will pay for our care is based on our diagnosis, what's wrong with us. If I get pneumonia and go to the hospital, it'll be that diagnosis that says to my insurance company what kind of care and how much I'm allowed to receive and for how long. It doesn't work that way in long-term care. In this setting, the resident's care dictates what their benefit is. So if everything they receive isn't reported, they don't get all the insurance benefit they're entitled to. Back in '96, the state went to a reimbursement system called case mix. What it is a system that places every resident in an individual level of care based on the amount of care they receive. In 1998, the federal government adopted that for Medicare residents. Then subsequently, all of your other Medicare plans like Security Blue, UPMC, Advantage, all those, they adopted the same model. So that when you report resident care, whether it be you, your licensed nursing staff, your therapists, any of the other ancillary disciplines, the amount of care that they report they've provided to the resident is all totaled up to place a resident in a specific level of care. That level then will dictate what the resident's entitled to receive. The thinking was, in going to that model, that instead of basing the resident's benefits on what was wrong with them or how much their care cost, it would literally be based on how much care was reported for them to have received. The thinking at the levels of government where this was created was the opportunity existed for you to fail to report things. Everything you underreported would result in the resident getting less benefit. It's very much like doing your income taxes. You know, if you know what all the deductions are that you're entitled to, and you've saved all your receipts, and you know how to fill out the forms, you get everything back you're entitled to in your return. But if you miss a deduction or you lose a receipt, you simply get less. That was really the thought process in setting up the benefit structure that our Medicaid and Medicare residents have to follow now. So that makes it that much more important that you don't underreport or don't miscoding care that you actually provide to the residents, because literally you are the ones who determine whether they get the benefits they're entitled to. And your documentation for Medicare residents can make $2,000 a month differences in whether they get the benefits that they're entitled to for their care. So you're obviously doing your documentation to establish expectations and watch residents' performance. But you're also determining whether they get the insurance benefit they're entitled to. As such, all of the codes that you use for self-performance and support can literally be translated into increments of time. And setting up the levels that residents are assigned to for their reimbursement, they did staff time studies at different times. There was one in '89 and '90, there was one in '96 and '97, and then recently there was one in 2006 and '07. And in these staff time studies, what they did in the participating facilities was they literally had logs in resident rooms. And whenever an RN, an LPN, or a CNA would go into a room to provide care, they would have to log in who they were, the time they arrived, and what they were there to do. They would then provide that resident care and document how they did it and the time that they completed it. So they could see if a nurse had gone in to start an IV, how many minutes did that take? Or if you had gone into toilet a resident, how long did that take at whatever level of assistance you described for that resident? So all of the codes that you use for all the activities that you document now literally can be ascribed to an average amount of time for each activity you report. The idea was the more time spent with a resident in their care, obviously the more benefits that they would need to pay for your time and services. So not only did it determine what their benefit was going to be, it also became an expression of your own need for staffing. You literally now report what your need for staffing is based on how much care you deliver to a resident. If you look at, I have two copies, I wonder why I had so many pages. If you look at the last page in your handout packets, this is actually a copy of the staff time study that we use in Pennsylvania now. And without getting into too much detail, I wanted to share this with you because this is literally how you report your need for staffing relative to the care that you provide to your residents. What I did was I looked at your actual staffing for an entire week preceding my review. And in the 7 days, I took the 3 highest days and threw them out, and I took the 3 lowest days and threw them out, and I took the middle day in terms of staffing hours as representing the week. And if you look right here at these numbers, in the gray area, those are the number of hours worked by RNs, LPNs, and CNAs that day. I then took all of the levels, which are represented in the long gray column, that you assigned your residents to on that day. There were 74 residents in the facility that day, and the abbreviations down the left-hand margin are actually abbreviations for the levels residents can be assigned to. So, in using the staff time study, I simply plugged in the number of residents you had assigned to each level. Because of the staff time study then, it says, based on those levels, how many RN hours, LPN hours, CNA hours, and total nursing hours are required to provide the amount of care you reported for that day. It then compares that at the bottom to from what your total staffing was that day to what you reported your need for staffing to be that day. And in terms of nursing hours per patient day, that's just a representation of the number of total nursing hours divided by the number of residents that you had in the building. It says how many direct care hours were available for each resident. The regulations require that nursing homes maintain 2.7 or higher to run a nursing home. Below that, they feel that there would be insufficient staff to provide care for typical nursing home residents. Your staffing, you can see on that day, was 3.14, or it was significantly higher than the bare minimum needed for nursing home residents. And really, that to me seemed an appropriate staffing model for your population. You have a group of residents who's very dependent on your time and attention for their care. So 3.14 seemed like an appropriate staffing pattern. It's very typical of not-for-profit nursing homes around the Commonwealth. And so when I saw that, I thought, okay, I understand the need for that. Then when I looked at what your documentation suggested you needed, it only said 2.8, which is much closer to the minimum needs of a nursing home population. So there was a fairly significant disagreement between what your actual staffing was and what your reported need seemed to be. Well, obviously, when I see that, my first question is, where does that come from? Where can I find that disconnection? Why doesn't it match? And so I start looking at the very bottom where it says actual number of staff versus predicted number of staff. The actual number is the people, obviously, that you had here. The predicted number is based on what was documented in clinical records, in your ADL flow sheets, in documentation by the other disciplines. So I looked at first the licensed nursing staff. Now you'll notice the predicted is 7 RNs, you only had 4. The predicted LPNs is 4, you actually had 7. That's because when they do these studies, the Nurse Practice Act varies from state to state. And in each state, there will be a little core set of things that LPNs are not allowed to do that have to be done by RNs. So when they do these national staff time studies, they have to account for every state. In Pennsylvania, LPNs are not allowed to work the central lines. In Ohio, it might be something else. In West Virginia, something else. So by the time they've canvassed the entire country and compiled the list of things LPNs are not allowed to do and shifted them over to the RN side of the table, it makes it look like so many more RNs would be necessary than are really necessary in our state. So when I look at licensed nursing staff, I simply look at total licensed nursing staff. What we have here is 7 RNs and 4 LPNs predicted. We have 4 RNs and 7 LPNs actual. So it's 11 and 11. What that means then literally is that the licensed nursing staff typically is documenting and taking credit for all of the things that they're doing for the residents, and they're demonstrating the need for all of them to be here. When I looked at your documentation, you had 18 CNAs on staff that day. Your documentation indicated you only needed 14, or you were overstaffed by 4 people that day. 4 people in 18 is more than 20%. That would mean that 1 in 5 of you were not necessary. Or, in simple terms, if 1 in 5 of you had failed to show up for work that day, it would not have made any difference because you weren't needed to be here anyway. Obviously, that's not true. If you lost 20% of your staff during that day, it would have been a disaster. So why is there such a difference between what you documented and what you actually needed? To me, the answer to that is really fairly simple. You go through your entire certification class and nobody teaches you to document. They tell you how to provide care, they tell you how to take care of your residents, how to do everything just right, and at the end of the day, they never tell you how to report anything you did. Well, it's not logical to expect that everyone would guess how to do the same thing correctly. Coupled with the fact that the documentation format you have to use is very cumbersome and difficult, it's no stretch to think that people would underreport or would not follow the instructions specifically to the letter. And when we talk about the documentation format that you're required to use, it's completely dependent on you being able to do that. Everyone has to use the same definition for every one of the codes. Everyone has to be using the same set of instructions for determining how to select a code. The more you rely on your own knowledge and experience to decide what a code means to you personally, the less likely you are to accurately report care. So I think that a lot of where I saw that, that difference between your actual and your predicted nursing need was in people not really understanding what exactly it is that you're being asked to do. As is typical with any government program, we have a 37-page standardized reporting form to report resident care on. There are 600-odd pages of instructions for how to complete that form. We're all responsible for using it and being accurate with it, and there's very little or no instruction as to how to use it. So everywhere I go, there are varying degrees of success with regard to how effectively people are able to manage that tool. And to me, it all boils down to, can you get out to the folks you're asking to do the documentation of their care and explain to them exactly what it is you're asking for? I think by and large, people are going to give you what you ask for 90% of the time if you explain to them what that is. If you don't take the time to explain it to them, though, it's a much more dicey proposition to get what you're looking for. So when you're coding your resident care and you're documenting how much assistance was provided to those residents, there are a specific set of instructions for how to do that. What the instructions tell you to do is code the highest level of assistance you provide a resident with any part of an activity, any time that it occurs throughout your shift, regardless of that resident's ability. They specifically tell you don't code what you believe the resident's capable of or what's typical for them or what's care planned. Only document the performance you witnessed in the last 8 hours. Because residents may not always perform up to their ability, they will inevitably have good days and bad days. Their performance will suffer when they get ill. It'll improve as they get better. So the idea is to look at actual daily performance over time to determine when those residents' needs change. Remember, all of your daily documentation is compared to what was happening when the care plan was written. The whole idea is we want to know when there's good days and bad days. We want to know when over a period of time a resident's not doing as well as they used to, so that we can go back and examine, are our plans for that resident still valid, or do we need to change our approaches? The reason they ask you to document the most assistance you provide to a resident is simply this. You're intended to represent your need for staffing based on the way you document. If you documented residents at the least you did for them every day, and then the following day you staffed according to that documentation, you're going to be staffing fewer people. You'd have 14 CNAs, not 18. So what would happen if you documented everybody at their best level of performance today, staffed that way tomorrow, and then people needed more help? Your staff would be stretched pretty thin trying to get to everybody. Resident needs might not be met. So they figure if you document the most assistance you give them today, and then you need that same highest level of assistance again tomorrow, if you base tomorrow's staffing on that, then there will always be enough people here to handle your residents' needs. The idea is you're looking at worst case scenarios, not best. And when they say document the highest level of assistance at any point in the shift, obviously residents will have activities that occur multiple times in every shift. Toileting at Q2 hours will happen at least 4 times. On day shift, there will be at least 2 meals. So there will be a lot of things that you do more than once. The resident may not perform the same way each time. You may have a resident that you can supervise their toileting activity 4 out of 5 times. But during your shift, there's one incontinent episode that requires a clothing change and a partial bath, and it requires maybe 2 of you to do that. Their code for the shift isn't the 4 times they were supervised, it's the 1 time they were extensive assistants. That becomes the code for the shift because it was the most you did. So you're always looking for that high point in the shift. Where was your greatest involvement with that resident? That becomes the code, and it only needs to happen 1 time during your shift to become the code. When they talk about providing the highest level of assistance with any part of an activity as well, obviously a lot of activities contain multiple different parts to them. I think probably toilet use is the best example of that. The activity of toilet use includes how that resident gets to or from wherever the elimination need is met. It includes how they manage their clothing, how they manage incontinence supplies like briefs or pads, how they do their personal hygiene and pericare, how they get dressed and back out of the bathroom or wherever that elimination need is met and on their way. All of those are components of that activity. So you're looking at which part of that activity requires the most assistance to be representative of the entire activity. Or if you look at bed mobility, there's another good example. Bed mobility includes how that resident rolls from one side to another and maintains their position in bed. It includes when they're getting ready to transfer, how do they spin around into a sitting position on the side of the bed to get ready to transfer. And it also includes when they've slid down to the foot, how are they repositioned to the head of the bed. Your resident might need a different amount of help with each part of that activity. You may be able to walk into the room and ask a resident to roll over so you can check the pad under them. Well, if you ask them to roll over and they do, because you asked them, that's cueing, the code would be supervision. But when they want to sit up on the side of the bed to transfer, you have to pull the covers back so they can slide their feet out and spin around. That's a limited assistance. However, when they need to be pulled up in bed, you need to have a partner to go in and grab the draw sheet and lift them to the head of the bed. That's dependent. Since there are 3 different levels of assistance with the activity, you're simply asked to focus on whichever one's the most. Do you want to staff your facility based on the resident's ability to roll over on command, or do you want to staff your facility based on the resident's need to have 2 people there to pull them up? That's why the instructions are so specific. Most assistants, any part of an activity, any point in the shift, regardless of ability. And they simply ask you to select the 2 codes that best explain that. And if you look at your first page, excuse me, your self-performance and support codes are listed here. Each one has a very specific definition, and they're asking you simply to use the definitions that are provided to you. For self-performance, you can select from independent, supervision, limited assistance, extensive assistance, or dependent. Independent as a code means there's no staff involvement with any part of the activity at any time. Every time it occurs, that resident performs the entire thing by themselves. I saw a lot of independent codes when I did the reviews of both the charts and the resident assessments. And I can tell you, based on the instructions, it's unlikely that an independent code is ever the correct code. Not that a resident can't be independent. The instructions say specifically, regardless of their ability to be independent, code what you actually did. Okay, independent, there's no involvement of any kind. Supervision is defined as providing that resident cueing, encouragement, or oversight at least 1 time during your shift. Cueing is simply asking a resident to do something. If I walk in and ask that resident to roll over so I can check the pad under them, if the resident says, sure, Bob, and rolls over, it wasn't independent, they rolled over because I cued them to do it. By definition, that makes it supervision. Or I remind a resident it's time to go to lunch, or I remind a resident to use their walker when they get up. All of that is cueing a resident to do something. By definition, that makes it supervision. Or if I go to a resident at lunch and I say, please make sure to drink all your fluids today. It's hot outside, which today it obviously isn't. I don't want you to get dehydrated. Make sure you drink enough. I'm encouraging that resident to drink fluids. Regardless of the fact that they may drink them by themselves, I provided that encouragement. By definition, my encouragement of that resident to perform an activity is coded as supervision. And if you look at the 3rd example or type of supervision, oversight. If you provide oversight for an activity during your shift, what you've done by definition is provide supervision. Oversight literally means to watch over. Oversight for an activity is ensuring that that activity occurs for that resident when it's supposed to and how it's supposed to. So going back to eating, independent versus supervision. Independent, the resident does everything by themselves, you're not involved. Supervision, you're providing oversight for the activity. So in terms of oversight, do you make sure every resident gets to the dining room or that the kitchen's notified where to send a tray to that person? Of course you do. Don't you also make sure before they get their tray that you review the tray to make sure it's the right meal for that person? You're not handing someone a pureed diet, a general tray? Don't you also document meal percentage and fluid consumption to ensure their intake was adequate? That's oversight to ensure they got to a meal, they got a meal, it was right for them, and they had enough of it. So the only person who can get an independent code for eating would be the person you could literally say, I didn't do any of those things. How often does that occur? I'm thinking roughly never. So what you do is go out and provide a tremendous amount of supervision for residents, particularly at mealtime, and then go back and report you didn't do any of it. So there's a big difference between what actually happened and what gets reported to have happened. All that time and effort that you spent then is negated in a code that says it didn't happen. Oversight for any activity has the same kind of basic principle to it. Oversight for a resident's dressing doesn't mean you watched them dress. It means at some point during your shift you ensured that they were appropriately dressed. They were dressed appropriately for the season and for them. They're not wearing torn, soiled, or stained clothing. Your residents with dementia aren't still wearing yesterday's clothing because they refuse to put on new clothes every day. You're not having residents sitting around in the facility with their lunch in their lap. That's oversight. If there's some point during the shift you're checking your resident out to ensure that they're appropriately dressed and they're clean and they look the way they're supposed to, that was oversight. Oversight for ambulation is if a resident's supposed to be ambulatory, that at some point you actually saw them get up and walk. That they used the appropriate assistive devices. They needed a walker, that they were using it. They didn't forget it in the room. There wasn't a gait or balance problem that made you think they might fall. They weren't ambulating in unsafe areas, wet floors. They weren't getting into other people's things. If you provide oversight for an activity to ensure it occurred for the resident and it was done appropriately, then by definition that's supervision. The only time you can code any activity as independent is when you can say in the last 8 hours there was never a time that I provided any oversight for that activity. It's just so unlikely to happen in this setting with your residents, with your job descriptions, and the things that you have to do. For a resident to get through an entire shift with no oversight, they would literally almost have to slam the door in your face and you'll go away. You can't provide oversight through a closed door. Otherwise, you're constantly going to be trying to find ways to make sure your residents are doing what they're supposed to and getting everything they need. So don't negate your efforts by saying that you didn't do that or you weren't engaged in that. You spend a lot of time providing supervision to your residents in the form of oversight and encouragement. Make sure that you take credit for having done so. Now, when you get to the limited assistance code, you physically become involved in the act with the resident. And I think the best way to look at the self-performance codes is based on your own involvement. As you become more involved, the code increases. Okay, at an independent, there is no involvement. It's zero. All right? When you become involved by watching the resident or talking to them, the code increases and becomes supervision. When you have to stop what you're doing and physically become involved in the task with the resident, the code increases again and becomes a limited assistance. It's defined as physical non-weight-bearing support, and the resident remains highly involved in that activity. That's a long-winded way of saying you laid your hands on that resident. The minute you physically become involved in any task, the code becomes a limited assistance. If you look at it in simplest possible terms, if you could walk in a room with a resident with your hands in your pockets and get from beginning to the end of an activity and your hands stay in your pockets the whole time, you're supervising. If there comes a point in time where you have to pull your hands out of your pockets, you're involved. So the question becomes, what is it you're doing for that resident? And where most caregivers are likely to underreport is when their involvement is at its least. There's always a tendency to want to emphasize what the resident did and minimize your own involvement. That's natural for any healthcare provider. But in this case, with this particular set of rules and instructions, the idea is you have to focus on when are the times that you are actually involved and how much. A limited assistance is, as it says, limited. In walking a resident to the bathroom, if you put an arm on their shoulder because you know they're a little bit unsteady, that's called a contact guard. That's limited assistance with ambulation. If you physically put your hands on that resident, if you get involved in an activity in any way, it's a limited assistance. You may have a resident who, for AM care or PM care, can completely wash and dress themselves appropriately. And so you're going to check them out, make sure they did a good job, you're going to co-supervision. But let's say their AM care was just supervised. 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the resident's chilled and asks you to go get their sweater. So you go to the room, grab their sweater, and you come back and put the sweater around their shoulders. Even though they were supervision with dressing in the morning, putting that sweater around their shoulders in the afternoon is a limited assistance with dressing. So your highest level of assistance during a shift doesn't have to happen when you expect it to. It could happen anytime during the shift. And if you've either already coded dressing, or if you forget at the end of the shift that you gave them that sweater later, then you wind up with a code that's less than what you actually did at some point. So you have to wait as late in the shift as possible and think back over the entire 8 hours. With the activity of dressing, what was the most I did today for that resident? Well, yeah, about 2 o'clock I had to put the sweater on for them. Okay, so the code for that shift now is limited assistance, not the supervision from the morning. Any assistance whatsoever. The extensive assistance code. The definition simply says weight-bearing support was provided. It's very cut and dry, it's very simple, but in practice it's maybe a little more difficult sometimes to apply in real-world situations. Any weight-bearing assistance with any part of the activity, at any time it occurs throughout the shift. So let's take that same resident who goes into the bathroom. I set up their base and their overbed table with personal effects, and they wash and dress themselves. Well, I get into the bathroom, and I realize my resident can't get their own shoes on.
Mary Verdi.
Mary Verdi? Okay. So I go in, I kneel down, I pick up her foot, I put her shoes on, and tie them, and she goes on her way. I'm tempted to look at her and say she was so involved in the activity she's a limited assistance. But in fact, when I picked up her foot, was there any weight there? It's a weight-bearing assistance then. It's only the weight of her foot, but it doesn't say it has to be 10 pounds before it counts, or it has to be half of their body weight, or it has to be strenuous or difficult. It says, did you provide weight-bearing assistance, yes or no? Yes, I did, the weight of her foot. So even though she pretty much dressed herself, part of that activity required me to bear part of her weight. So regardless that she did the majority of the activity, her code for dressing is extensive assistance. Weight bearing, period, cut and dry. Did you or didn't you? 1 pound is sufficient. If I need to help a resident to roll over in bed so I can provide their elimination care, if I put one hand at the hip and shoulder and I push to roll them, my pushing is taking a part of that resident's body weight on myself to accomplish that position change. So if I push or pull on a resident, if I put a hand behind their back to help them sit up to get ready to transfer, that's weight-bearing assistance with bed mobility. I'm bearing a portion of that person's weight to help them accomplish that task. It doesn't have to be a significant portion. It doesn't have to be physically strenuous or difficult for me. It simply has to be part of their weight. If you grab the handles of a wheelchair and push, the minute that chair begins to roll, they're extensive assistance with locomotion. Regardless that they may propel their own chair throughout the unit or the facility, the entire shift, if there comes a time during the shift that you push the chair, it happened at least once, it became the highest level for the shift, and now their code is extensive assistance and it can't be less for the entire shift. That highest level only has to happen one time to be the code for the shift. So you have to constantly be looking and thinking, when I interacted with that resident, did I bear any part of their weight? If the answer is yes, your code is automatically extensive assistance. Now, there will also inevitably be situations where there's no part of the activity that requires weight-bearing assistance. If you think about feeding a resident, there's not going to be a point in time typically feeding a resident where you're going to provide a weight-bearing assist. So how would you know from the time you gave them their first bite of a meal and they became a limited assistance to when you fed them the entire meal and they were dependent, at what point did they become extensive assistance? You have to go look at participation then if weight bearing isn't part of the activity. Who did how much of the activity? Remember, the limited assistance definition says the resident has to be the one who's highly involved. For them to get that code, they have to be the one highly involved in the activity. The person who's highly involved is the person who's doing the majority of the work. So if your resident's doing the majority of that activity and you're involved to a lesser extent, they're a limited assistance. But when you cross that tipping point, where now the resident's not doing as much as you're doing the majority of that activity, or you're doing all of some component of that activity, you become the one highly involved, and they no longer qualify as a limited assist, they have to become extensive. So for any activity where weight bearing isn't part of the activity, you have to simply look at who's doing more of this, me or them. If you're talking about feeding a resident a meal, who's actually feeding the resident more of the portion of the meal that they eat, you or them? Do you have a resident that you set them up and encourage them to eat, and they'll eat maybe 75, 80% and just they kind of peter out at the end? So you go sit down with them, help them with their last couple bites in their fluids. They did much more self-feeding than you did feeding for them. So they were the one highly involved. It's a limited assistance. But you could just as easily have a resident where you go in and cue and encourage them and keep reminding them to eat. They take a couple bites, plop their spoon down and quit, and you literally go now sit and feed them 90% of that meal. They're no longer highly involved in the activity. You're the one that's doing most of it. So that makes that resident an extensive assistance. Or maybe with bathing. You set a resident up in the tub room and they can pretty much wash themselves, but they can't reach their back. So you're going to wash their back for them. They've done most of it. You've done a little bit. They're a limited assistance. But you could also have that resident with dementia who you cue and encourage, and the best performance you can get is you prepare a face cloth and wash the face and hands and you do everything else. Well, you can't say that resident was the one highly involved. It was you. That makes that resident then an extensive assistance. So if there's weight bearing involved, it's automatically extensive. If there isn't weight bearing, then you have to look at participation. Who did more? Then the last code, dependent, I think everybody's pretty comfortable with. You're doing the entire body of work for the resident every time that activity occurs, and they really have no participation at all. That's dependent. When you code dependent, though, it's important to make sure that the resident has no active participation. For care planning purposes, if a resident has any participation, even in a limited fashion, even if it's not a lot of help, you want to still code them extensive assistance and focus on whatever they can still do. Because once we have a resident coded as dependent, we no longer have any expectation for them to participate in their own care. And obviously that's the last thing we want, is for residents not to be able to participate in their own care and their own daily routine. So maybe you have a resident that when you're pulling them up in bed, they'll try to dig in with their heels and help you push. Might not be a lot of help. Might not be any help at all, really. But they're still attempting to be involved with that activity. So we want to focus on that little thing they're still doing and try to foster them to continue to be involved in that fashion as long as possible. So when you code dependent, just make sure that, at the end of the day, there really wasn't anything they were doing that helped you to complete that task. Okay? And when I say meaningful involvement, I think back to a service I did a while ago, where somebody asked me the question, if we're transferring somebody with a full body lift and they're holding onto the sling, does that constitute involvement? No, it doesn't help you get any closer to completing that transfer. The resident can hold on to that sling until the cows come home and they're not going to get any closer to the chair. So when I say meaningful involvement, they mean it's going to help you get closer to accomplishing your task. So when you're coding dependent, you're thinking, did they do something to help me get through this? Or did I do everything that made this particular activity happen? And all they're saying when they ask you to use these codes, you simply use those definitions and you pick the one that best describes the most you did today. If you had to watch the resident or talk to them, you pick supervision. When you physically get involved, you pick limited assistance. If you have to bear weight or do more than the resident did, you're going to pick extensive assistance. Or if you did the entire thing, you're going to pick dependent. It's based on what you saw in the last 8 hours with that resident. It doesn't matter if it's not yesterday's code or what you expected when you got here or what's care planned. It's what that resident demonstrated for you today. That's all that they're asking. What happened in the last 8 hours? Because going back to the beginning, we're trying to find out when they're having good days or bad days. We're trying to identify when their performance is changing over time and they're needing more help. And you're the ones that are always going to find that. You'll see it before anyone else because you have more intimate knowledge of your residents than anybody else in this building. You know them better, you spend more time with them. If anything's different, you'll see it first. And all we're trying to do is find a way within the framework that's required of us to get that knowledge from your heads onto paper so everyone can see it. Because when you take that step from nursing assistants to charge nurses, there's a significant drop-off in intimate knowledge about resident performance. When you go from charge nurses to supervisors, there's another drop-off. When you leave the nursing department, you go to activities or social service or any other ancillary discipline, there's an even bigger drop-off. The only way to communicate what to expect from residents is to have the people caring for them describe what they're doing every day so everyone knows what to expect. If I'm an activities director and I'm trying to care plan what's appropriate to expect from my resident, what can they do? What can I engage them in? Well, I'm going to need to know what they're doing right now, aren't I? I'm going to have to ask you guys, what is it that I can expect from this resident? And really, that's what we're looking for. What can I expect? And then when there is a change, your only responsibility when a resident doesn't perform up to expectations is you simply document what they actually did, and you go to your charge nurse and tell them what the difference is. Yeah. Hey, Mr. Smith's having more trouble with ambulation and transfer today. He went to go to the bathroom, I thought he was going to fall down. That's it. That was your responsibility. You coded his performance, how much you had to be involved with helping to get him there, and you go tell your nurse. That nurse can then tell the oncoming shift, hey, Mr. Smith's having problems, make sure somebody's in the bathroom with him tonight. Okay, you come back tomorrow and he's back to baseline and he's supervision. Today was just a bad day. Everybody has them. But it was a bad day everybody knew about because you documented and reported it. But what if you come back again tomorrow and he needs help again tomorrow? Now that's 2 bad days in a row. What about the day after tomorrow? That's not 3 bad days, that's a pattern. That's a decline. If a resident fails to perform at baseline 3 consecutive days in a row, that's a decline. At that point in time, now everybody needs to get involved with trying to figure out why is the decline occurring and what can we do about it. Do we need to call the doctor to look at him? Do we need to make a referral to therapy? Do we just adjust our approaches? Is he getting sick? Is he on a new med? Nobody knows to ask those questions until somebody reports he's different. And that's really, I think, fundamentally the core reason why you're doing what you're doing is because that gives everybody the ability to recognize that. So when you're coding, highest level of assistance, any point in the shift, any part of the activity, you're watching or talking to supervision, you get involved as limited assistance, you bear weight or do more than the resident's extensive, you do the whole thing is dependent. Pick the code that best describes the most you did and report any changes in the resident. And remember too, it's not just the codes that have specific definitions. The activities themselves have very specific definitions, and you have to make sure that you're looking at those definitions and describing the entire activity as it was intended. For one thing, eating. People have a tendency a lot of times to look at eating as representing breakfast, lunch, and supper, which obviously it does. But the activity is described as any time the resident eats or drinks anything, regardless of their skill, and the only thing excluded is the water that it takes for them to swallow their pills. Every other time they eat or drink anything is an opportunity to code eating. So it would include if they get a can of Ensure after a med pass, or they get a mid-morning juice, or an afternoon or HS snack, or if at 2 o'clock in the morning you're making rounds and they're thirsty and want to drink of water. That's all coded as eating. So their highest level of assistance with eating does not have to occur in the dining room. It could be anywhere. It could be an activity where food and beverages are served that they need their most assistance. So you have to really look at all the different opportunities there were for that resident to eat or drink anything and code the most help they got at any point in time. Most residents will perform well in the dining room. It's well lit, it's fully staffed, they have a perfectly organized tray in front of them, they have a lot of encouragement. What about that same resident at 9 o'clock at night on a unit with an HS snack? Or at 2 o'clock in the morning laying in bed half asleep trying to get a drink of water? I don't know about you, but the likelihood is very small that at 2 o'clock in the morning I would ever hand anybody in bed a glass of water and not stand there and hold the glass. Because I just don't want to invest 45 minutes in a bed change and cleaning up a resident at 2 o'clock in the morning. If you're holding that glass of water for that resident while they're drinking, that's extensive assistance with eating. They're not eating any food, but any food or beverages consumed by the resident outside of a med pass is considered as an eating code. So you have to look at that activity as encompassing all of those things. Toilet use is another one where a lot of times people tend to not really look at the entire definition of the activity. Toilet use, first off, has nothing to do with a toilet. It's just simply meant to look at resident elimination needs. When they need to void or have a BM, or if they need incontinent care, that's what toilet use is describing. And what it includes each time it happens is how does that resident get to and from wherever that need is met? How do they manage clothing? How do they manage incontinence supplies? How do they manage their pericare, their personal hygiene? How do they get put back together? All those components are part of toileting. And what I encountered many times when I looked at the documentation was that there were residents who needed a 2 or more person assistance to transfer, but they were coded to only need 1 person for toilet use. And it makes sense if you look at it in terms of, well, once they're transferred back to bed for their incontinent care, you can do it by yourself. That's not what the activity says. how do they get to the place where that incontinent care is provided? A transfer that's done for the purpose of assisting with elimination is part of toilet use. So you have to ask yourself, if it takes 2 people to get a resident out of bed, how are we getting them back to bed for incontinent care with less? Or are we really? Are we really using 2 people and just not coding that because we're not using the right definition of the activity? If a resident's being transferred to accomplish elimination care, then the transfer is part of that activity. Transfer itself is only coded separately when you're transferring a resident for no other purpose than to move them from one place to another. They're getting out of bed to their wheelchair or another chair, or they're getting from a wheelchair to a more comfortable chair, whatever. When elimination becomes part of the activity, then the transfer is part of the toilet use activity. And you have to look at that in terms of, did I actually provide that elimination care with less assistance than it took to actually transfer them? Most of the time it's no. There can be times if somebody's a Foley catheter or an ostomy or something, that potentially it is different. So I'm not saying it always has to be the same, but you have to think of it in those terms. If it took me 2 people to transfer, how did I accomplish this with less? Okay. Now, your support codes, there are also specific definitions for those. You can choose from independent, set up, 1 person or 2 or more people. Independent, again, with support is exactly the same as it was for self-performance. There's no involvement by the staff at any point in time. A setup assistance is simply providing that resident some sort of materials for a task. If you give them a meal tray and you take off the lids and you open the cartons, you're providing them the materials that they need for a meal. Or you set up that overbed table, basin, and personal effects in the bathroom. You're giving them materials to do AM or PM care. So when you're talking about a setup, it's just giving the resident something. The idea here is they're gauging your increasing involvement through the way you combine self-performance and support codes. At 0-0, there is no involvement on your part. You don't do anything. At 0-1, independent and setup, you're not involved in the task, but you do have to spend some time going and getting the resident things to accomplish it. Supervision and setup, not only do you go and get them things for the task, you watch them or talk to them. Once you physically become involved at a limited assistance, then the question changes to, is it 1 person or is it 2 or more people? They're not actually asking you how many people does it take. That's not the question. The question is literally, can you do this alone? Once you can't do it alone, it doesn't matter how many people it takes. It's the same code. It goes back to staffing. It literally goes directly to staffing. If I'm assigned care of a resident, and I document that all the care I've provided for that resident is a 1-person assistance, I can accomplish it myself, then I'm adequate staffing by myself. I don't need anybody else. If I select any one of their codes as a 2 or more person assistance, all of a sudden I'm no longer adequate. I need more people. So whether it's me and a single resident or it's the 74 people that were here on the day I started the review, it doesn't matter. The more times you need 2 or more people assistance, the more staff members have to be available to make that happen. What I saw led me to believe that really the biggest part of the difference in your reported need for staffing versus your actual need for staffing could be attributed to 1 versus 2 person assistance. I went and looked at a number of people who were coded as dependent but only 1 person assistance, when from my perspective, a dependent person with their mobility should not ever be a 1 person assistance. If they're not helping you at all, there should be 2 people to help them. Well, I looked to see if those people had been getting a 2 person assistance, what would that do to your staffing analysis, and it would have actually added the need for 3 more people in there. So that was an area that when I looked at it seemed to be particularly problematic to me. One of the residents I looked at was a 180 plus pound lady who was dependent, history of multiple falls, high risk for future falls, and consistently coded 1 person assistance. That's the type of resident that really we need to look at in terms of, is a 2 person assistance a safer approach to that resident? And that's something that facilities are engaging more and more in care planning to mitigate risks. Where's there a risk for something bad to happen to a resident? What can we do to minimize that risk? And when you're talking about resident mobility, nothing causes more injuries in healthcare, whether it's acute care, whether it's long-term care, or outpatient. Nothing results in more injuries to both caregivers and the people receiving the care than inadequate assistance with their mobility. it results in more falls, more staff injuries than anything else. And obviously, the best approach to minimizing those risks is add people. Everybody's so busy, though, that frequently isn't the first course of action. When we look at somebody who's high risk for falls, our easiest way to minimize the likelihood of an injury related to a fall is to get a second person in there. If I have a 180-pound resident with a center of gravity roughly about here, and they start to go down, what are the odds that I'm going to be sufficient to grab them, arrest the fall, and keep that from happening by myself? The odds are not good. The question is more, are they taking me with them than am I going to stop them? If I have a second person there, though, the odds of two of us being able to arrest that fall are much greater. And the likelihood of anybody getting hurt then is much smaller. So when I look at those residents, that becomes my first concern is where can somebody get hurt? And what I talked to the entire interdisciplinary team about yesterday was that really needs to become a central theme in care planning. Where are the residents with risks for something bad to happen? And it's not just their fall risk assessment. I mean, that's part of it, but do they have a history of falls or other kinds of injuries? If they would fall, do they have a medical condition that would make it difficult for them to heal or more likely for them to be injured? Do we have residents with advanced osteoporosis where they have very demineralized brittle bones and they're likely to break very easily? Do you have residents with chronic diabetes where healing could potentially be a problem? You know, they need to be looking at things like what kind of medications are they on that might make them dizzy or disoriented. You have residents here right after major orthopedic surgeries who are on narcotics. If they're taking narcotic pain pills, there's a real tendency for that person to be dizzy or disoriented because of their medications, which would increase the likelihood of them falling. You have people that take anti-anxiety medications, antipsychotic medications that could affect them. So there's a lot of different things that you need to look at in terms of risk factors. They're not always things that you'll be aware of, whether a resident's on a particular medication, or what their past medical history might be, or what the nurse's last fall risk assessment said about them. So those are things the care plan team really needs to look at in depth every time an assessment's done for a resident, because they'll change over time. And what I ask them to do is do that checklist every time you care plan every resident. And whenever you get to the point where you have more risks than you're comfortable with, you simply care plan a second person for safety. So there may be times when your nurses are coming to you and say, hey, we need you to start using 2 people. It's not that they're questioning your ability to care for your residents. They found something in that resident's care plan that makes them feel uncomfortable with a one-person approach, and they feel like it's safer and more likely to keep people from getting hurt to have that second person there. If that happens, somebody asks you to use a second person for safety, and you're not comfortable that you can find somebody or you can make that happen, your responsibility always ends at your nurse's shoe tips. Okay? If you're not sure how to make that happen, you go and ask your nurse. I need you to tell me how you want me to do that. It becomes their responsibility then to help you make that happen safely. So you don't have to feel like you have to take it on yourself and just make it happen. If there's a reason for somebody to have two people to keep them safe, then it's in their best interest that happens. If you don't know how to find the time or carve the time out of your day, go to your nurse and have them help you make it happen. That's the best possible approach that I can tell you. You just can't believe the number of accidents and incidents and major injuries that occur when transferring people, toileting people, pulling people up in bed. You can do something a particular way 100 times and nothing happened, but that one time it does happen, you can't take it back. It's not reversible. So you have to always be thinking in those terms. You know, what can I do to best protect the residents? I realize that from the time you punch in the morning to the time you punch out in the afternoon, it's like playing beat the clock. You got the Jeopardy theme playing in the back of your head all day long. I know that also that scenario makes people think like there isn't time to stop, take a breath, and think about things. But in reality, you have frail, dependent residents who need you to keep them safe. So don't let that ticking clock push you into doing something that you ordinarily wouldn't do. Also, with the new assessments we have to do for our residents and the frequency that we have to do them with, there's just not the time that there used to be for Chris and some of the other team members to get out there and look at residents in terms of, trying to identify changes in condition, trying to find when they're receiving new things, or maybe they're doing things like using oxygen. at a particular point in time that they don't typically use. We really have to depend now on all of you and all of your licensed nurses to look at particular things, and when you see things, report them so that that information gets back to Chris so she can decide, is this something we have to now generate a new assessment for? A lot of times when residents change the types of things they're receiving or the care they're getting, it means that the facility has to do a new assessment for the resident to report that service. And what I did was, I have a checklist here for you on the second page that shows all the different things that might change for a resident, might be new, might be different, that would potentially result in Chris needing to do a new assessment. So what I did was, I just put the checklist together, and if you see anything on this list that's new or different for one of your residents, it means you have to report it so the word gets back to Chris that it's happening. Then she can go and look, is this something that she actually needs to go and generate a new assessment for? The only way that this works now with the volume of assessments that have to be done is that everybody has to be able to take that information back to her and then let her make the judgment. So anything you would ever see on this list happening needs to be reported. And in doing that, we can make sure that all the things that we do for the residents actually make it onto their assessments and care plans and actually get reported for them. Okay? The last thing that I wanted to talk to you guys about briefly is another area that I looked at in the review that there seems to be some misconceptions about is restorative nursing. Restorative nursing, first off, it was really developed out of a staff time study that occurred back in 1989 and 90. When the staff time study was completed, the group that was analyzing the information that came out of it noticed that a particular group of people had a lot less interaction with nursing staff than the rest of the population. And their concern was, if they had less time with the nursing staff, number one, they were more likely to decline. But also, if they did decline, because you weren't with them as much, you were less likely to notice. And this group felt like that was a big risk for those individuals, and they thought, well, how do we lessen that risk? What can we do to make it less likely they'll decline or more likely you'll notice? And so they come up with the idea of restorative nursing. And simply put, the idea was just to put nursing measures in place to work with people where they either already had a problem or likely to develop one. And the thought was they would be able to function in those areas longer, better, but when they did decline, it would stand out and you would notice more quickly. And that was really their thought process in developing restorative nursing. The problem was, how did they entice providers to spend extra time doing it? And their obvious thought was, well, we'll just give them more money. As soon as they hung a dollar sign on restorative nursing, everybody went crazy. We had to have restorative nursing departments and manuals and policies and procedures and staff members. And the whole thing just exploded into something it was never meant to be. It's not therapy. It was never intended to be. Therapy requires you have a prior level of function, an onset date, a current lower level of function, and rehab potential to get better. Restorative requires none of those things. It simply requires a resident to have a risk for decline. We're going to monitor a resident who has a risk for decline to ensure they stay the same and don't decline. Or when they do, we can get involved more quickly. That's it. You don't need any of the same things for restorative that you need for therapy. Okay, they're simply nursing measures. Prior to that staff time study in 89 and 90 that created restorative, it was simply routine nursing care. You ranged people, you walked people, you fed people, you bathed people and clothed them because it was nursing care. After the staff time study, it was still just routine nursing care. The difference between restorative nursing and routine nursing care is the expectation for performance. That's really the only significant difference. I could go in to do AM care with a resident with the whatever it takes attitude. I walk in a room and I say, I'm not coming back out until it's done. That's routine nursing. I don't care what I have to do. I'm just going to go in and the task will be over. Or I could walk into that room and say, I have specific expectations for that resident. That resident's going to do their upper body dressing and they're going to brush their own hair. I'll help them with their lower body dressing and I'll clean their dentures. I'm going to know exactly what to expect from them walking in. If I have a clearly formulated goal for that resident when I walk in there, and I watch that resident perform and meet my expectation, and I can demonstrate how long it took me to do that, that's restorative nursing. Literally, that's the only difference. Having that expectation. And it's a good thing to have that expectation. How am I most likely to identify a change in resident performance? By not having any expectation for them, or by having specific expectations? If I go in and I don't care what it takes, am I going to notice if maybe gradually I'm doing more for that person? Or if I expect them to put their own shoes on and they don't, it'll stand right out. That's why restorative nursing is so valuable to residents, and particularly to nursing, because if I know what to expect from everybody, I know whether they meet my expectations. If the expectations are built around their performance when we did the care plan, this is what they were actually doing when we wrote the care plan. Is this what they're still doing today? If the answer is yes, our care plan is still valid, and we keep proceeding as usual. The minute I've got a week where 3 consecutive days or 3 days in that week they fail to meet my expectation, there's their decline. And most residents in nursing homes will have conditions that inevitably cause declines. Every resident with dementia will eventually lose the ability to effectively wash and dress themselves. If they live long enough, it will always happen 100% of the time. How are we going to know when that happens? We need to put a restorative ADL, dressing and grooming program, in place for them, describing everything they're doing today when we're writing the care plan. That becomes their goal, and every day now, when we go in and provide care for that resident, we're going to expect them to do that same thing. The first week they fail to meet our expectation 3 times, we don't have to wonder when they're going to decline any longer. They just did. And we were right on top of it. The first week it happened, we knew it happened, we addressed it, and we're on the phone to OT. Can you get them back to where they were? If they say yes, we treat them, we get them back, and we release them on the same goal. If OT says I can't get them back there, then we just adjust their goal to what they're doing now. We give them a new care plan, and we start with that goal. And we try to keep that going as long as we can. And the idea is, any place a resident has a risk for decline, we associate those nursing measures. If they have a immobility for some reason, it may just be that they're not highly motivated and like to just sit in their chair all day. Well, immobility is a major nursing problem, from constipation and urinary stasis and UTIs to muscle wasting and joint stiffness and pain. There's so many different reasons why immobility is bad. So how do we not have to deal with all the nursing consequences of immobility? We put people on restorative range of motion and ambulation programs. We get them up and moving. So looking at restorative that way, it's difficult then to accomplish your goals to reach all of your residents if you restrict your own access. This isn't something that's particular to here. This was an industry-wide problem for a long, long time, that people had dedicated restorative staff who were the only restorative providers. What happens with restorative providers in an 8-hour day is they're only given 6 of the 8 hours by the UMR teams that come from the state to inspect you to be productive treatment time. They can't claim more than 6 hours a day as treatment. So in 6 hours out of the day, 15 minutes of program, every one of your restorative providers can give 24 programs a day. 24 programs in 2 people, it's 48 possible residents who can receive restorative, and you had 74. How do you then decide which residents can receive restorative and which ones can't? Or more specifically, if you have 2 residents with the same problems and the same risk factors, how can you give one restorative programs and not give them to the other one? If they're valid for the first guy, they're valid for the second guy. But the second guy can't get them because the restorative aide is too busy to get to him. What happens when the second guy declines? Can you say that it's not your fault? Can you tell Department of Health it's not your fault? Department of Health will certainly say it is. You had the same risk factors for both residents. One you elected to provide restorative to and he didn't decline. The other you elected not to provide restorative to and he did decline. How is that not your fault to them? That's the question that you have to ask yourself when you limit your access to your own residents. The idea is you would love to have every resident on restorative programs that are associated with their greatest risks for decline or the places they already have problems. But if you only have a certain set of people that are allowed to do that, you can't effectively get to your residents. So inevitably, declines will have to persist longer and get worse before they're noticed, and potentially declines will happen that didn't have to. So the recommendation I'm making to the facility is that everybody in nursing is a potential restorative provider. There is no difference between routine nursing and restorative nursing outside of the expectation. Any resident you're feeding in the dining room could be a restorative dining program if you have a specific set of feeding instructions intended to get them to a goal. Maybe your goal is just with a modified diet and specific approaches, they won't choke or aspirate. Maybe your goal is that you're going to try to encourage them and provide them foods in such a way that you'll get to increase their meal consumption and they won't lose weight. Everybody being fed could potentially be receiving a restorative program depending on your expectations and your care plan for that person and their problems. Or anytime you walk a resident to a dining room, it could potentially be an ambulation program. All of your AM and PM care could potentially be ADL programs. If there's a measurable, objective goal for that resident's performance that appears in their care plan, and you're consistently applying a set of interventions to get them to perform at that level, that's all restorative is. And the more people you can get to doing that, the more likely you will identify their change more quickly. You'll be able to get involved with whatever you need to do to resolve that change more quickly, and the likelihood of their declines becoming reversible increases in proportion to how quickly you can identify them. So a lot of what we're doing, we have to do because the government tells us we have to do it. But in reality, a lot of what we're doing because it's good nursing practice. You know, we want to be able to see what residents are doing on a daily basis. We want to have something to compare that to so we can quantify, if they're not doing as well, how much worse are they doing? Is it happening all the time? Maybe they're only having a problem at night. Maybe they're only having a problem first thing in the morning. We can adjust our care plan goals to particular times to add more assistance to them at those times. Or maybe there's something we can do to resolve the issue. But the whole idea with your ADL documentation is it counts for so much. There's so many things it's used for that it really gives you a loud and clear voice in that care plan conference. Even if you're not attending the conference, everything that you say about the resident is attending. So you're the biggest part of how functional goals are formulated in care planning. You're the biggest part of how the facility is going to identify changes and when residents aren't meeting those goals. Your documentation is going to demonstrate where they are from day to day and when they're declining and when we need to get involved with changing our approaches to them. Your restorative interventions with residents potentially are going to allow you to be more effective in identifying when those risk factors for decline become actual declines. There's just so much that you're doing, I mean, from a nursing perspective, but then you have to realize in this setting, you're determining what their insurance benefit is. Whether they get what they paid for is up to you. If you report everything, they get what they're entitled to, and if you don't, they won't. It may not be a fair and equitable system, but it's the system that we're stuck with. So for residents to get their Medicare benefits, it's dependent on nursing to report everything they received to get that for them. And also, you can't ignore the fact that you're really telling Mr. Garver how to staff the building based on what you document. And Cindy, you know, I mean, if you tell him you need 14 people, well, guess what? You've got 18, you're not getting any more. If you needed another person and you were documenting you needed 20 people, it would be a lot easier to go to him and say, hey, you know, we need another person. Look, this documentation says we don't have enough. If you got documentation that says you're overstaffed by 4 people, you're definitely not getting a 5th one. So it's not meaningless documentation. It just doesn't go anywhere. And you're obliged to fill out your books because you don't want to get in trouble for leaving blanks. It really counts for a lot of different things. And you want to focus on good days and bad days. You got to expect a population with an average age in the 80s and a lot of chronic debilitating diseases would have good days and bad days. You don't have to feel uncomfortable in putting down a code that doesn't match somebody else's code. It just means the resident didn't do the same thing today. And I expect to see that. You know, when I'm looking at charts and I'm looking at ADL documentation, I expect to see peaks and valleys. I don't expect a 90-year-old to do the same thing every day the same exact way. I expect some days they'll be tired and they won't feel very well. I expect other days they'll be having a good day and do really well. You know, I would expect that, and you shouldn't feel uncomfortable. As long as your code matches the definition and represents the most you did, it is the code that day. The only thing you have to make sure to do is when your code changes, you need to go make sure you tell your nurse about it so they can pass it along, and then they can start looking at, is this a developing pattern or was it an isolated incident? Any questions?